The snow began falling sometime after the bells rang for Tess Rollins's wedding. Thick, quiet flakes, soft as down, drifted past the crooked eaves of the general store and caught in the lace trim of Willa May Hart's coat, the same coat she'd worn at her mother's funeral not a week before. It hung too large on her narrow shoulders, frayed at the hem and missing 2 buttons, but it was warm enough if she kept walking and didn't think too long on what was behind her. She did not look back at the church. She had no reason to. No one there was waiting for her, and even if they were, they'd be doing it from behind a veil of judgment. Willa's boots scuffed ice patches on the way to Sheriff Pike's office, the parcel in her gloved hands near bursting. She'd brought all she had left, 3 jars of pickled peaches, sealed before Ma got sick, and 1 tin of biscuits baked dry to last. She would have brought the last of the sewing too, but she needed the quilt to sleep under. Inside the sheriff's post, the heat felt borrowed. Amos Pike sat behind the desk, squinting at her beneath a graying brow. He was a man built from law, stiff and squint-eyed, too old to chase bandits, too proud to retire. He gestured at the parcel with a grunt. "That all you're offering?" "I need flour," Willa said. Her voice was soft but steady, like dry grass that refused to bend. "Store won't take it." "I know. That's why I came to you." He scratched at his beard, then leaned back in his chair. "There's a man out by the ridge. Apache, name's Chaska. Hunted 2 deer, but he don't eat preserves. He might trade if you go yourself." Willa hesitated. "You want me to ride up the pass? In this snow?" "Snow's not heavy yet. But it's comin'. You'll make it if you leave now." She nodded, and that was all. Because when you're down to trade jars for bread, your pride's already spent. Outside, her horse was waiting, old Ginny, sway-backed but loyal. She loaded the parcel onto the saddle and pulled herself up, feeling the cold bite her thighs through the thin fabric of her skirt. The wind curled around her like a cruel thing. Nobody in town watched her leave. But she could feel them eyes behind curtains, muttering lips saying things like her mother was always too soft, and that girl won't last winter. The trail narrowed past Willow Creek. Snow deepened around her boots where she dismounted to lead Ginny uphill. Pines loomed, black and towering, branches heavy with frost. Every breath hurt her lungs. By the time she saw the cabin, low-roofed, built stout against the slope, her legs trembled. Smoke twisted from the chimney in a lazy column. She knocked once on the frame, her knuckles numb. The door opened before the sound faded. He filled it. Chaska was the biggest man she'd ever seen, taller than the frame by a full head, his shoulders blocking the light behind him. Bare arms crossed his chest, skin the color of river clay, muscles corded like ropes. His black hair hung loose past his collarbone, streaked with snow. His eyes, dark as coals buried in ash, scanned her from boots to braid. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, voice even and low. "I wanted a sturdy woman." Willa's face burned hotter than the fire behind him. She stepped back. "I can leave." But she didn't. She couldn't. The wind screamed now through the pine trunks, and somewhere distant, thunder cracked, a sky snap that meant the snow was turning fierce. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her, like he was measuring not her size, but her silence. Then he moved aside. "You'll freeze before you reach the bend," he said. She crossed the threshold. The warmth hit her like an embrace she hadn't earned. The cabin was dim, flickering with firelight. Pine walls, a simple cot in the corner, pelts hanging to dry. A pot simmered on the stove. Venison, from the smell of it. And something earthy beneath, juniper, maybe. Or sage. She stood awkward, parcel clutched. He pointed at a low bench near the fire. "Sit." "You're shaking." "I'm not." "You are." She sat. He took the parcel from her, unwrapped it gently. Looked at the jars without comment. Then he ladled a portion from the pot into a tin bowl, added 2 slices of hard bread from a cloth-wrapped loaf, and set it before her. "You'll eat," he said. She stared at the food, unsure if it was a gift or part of a trade. When she didn't move, he turned his back and went to tend the fire, splitting more kindling with practiced ease. Only then did she eat slowly, mouth dry from the heat and salt. She hadn't tasted meat in 4 days. Her hands shook too much to finish the bowl. She set it aside and tucked them into her coat sleeves. The room was quiet. Not empty. Just still. "You live here alone?" she asked, more to fill the silence than anything. He didn't turn around. "I live where I'm not hunted." She lowered her gaze. "I'm Willa. Willa May Hart." He turned at last, nodding once. "Chaska." The way he said it held weight, as if he was saying more than just his name. A gust of wind slapped the shutters, and snow hissed against the walls like static. The storm had come full. "You won't ride out tonight," Chaska said. "The trail's gone already. I'll sleep near the fire." He grunted. "I'll take the cot." "No," she said too quickly. "It's yours." He raised an eyebrow, just slightly. But he didn't argue. Instead, he threw another pelt beside the hearth and laid out a second one. "You'll freeze without that," she warned, nodding toward the thicker fur. He didn't respond. Just handed it to her. She curled beneath it, facing the fire. The warmth of the stew in her belly mixed with the quiet fatigue of long hunger and longer loneliness. "Somewhere between sleep and sorrow," she whispered. "I don't take up much room, I know that." Chaska didn't reply. But she felt something shift. Not in the air. In the space between two people who have no reason to trust each other except that both are cold and tired of being misunderstood. A long silence passed before he said, "Small fire still keeps you alive." Willa blinked, eyes stinging. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow thickened to a hush. And inside, where judgment could not reach, something old and necessary, like mercy, began to thaw. The storm stretched on, as storms do when God wants you still. By the second morning, the snow had buried the trail to Willa's knees and turned the cabin's windows to white-painted glass. Beyond the hearth, the world no longer seemed real, just a blur of wind and ice in endless hush. She rose early, stiff and aching, finding her limbs slow from the cold that crept in during the night. Chaska had already been up, stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil over the embers. He didn't greet her. He never did with words. But the room held a warmth beyond the fire. Willa sat in silence as he passed her a tin cup. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the bitter scent and the steam. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and he didn't flinch. Nor did she. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It had weight. Like snowfall on pine boughs, soft, steady, and somehow sacred. He moved about the cabin with a kind of grace that made no fuss. Cut wood. Sorted dried herbs into pouches. Checked traps hanging by the door. She watched him, not out of suspicion but fascination. He was unlike anyone in town, anyone she'd ever known. There was no rush in him. No shame. He did each thing as though it mattered, and that steadiness made her feel less like a burden and more like a guest. After breakfast, he showed her how to repack the kindling to keep the fire from choking on ash. His hands moved slow, guiding hers. She fumbled once, almost dropping a coalpick, and mumbled an apology. "No shame in learning," he said. The words surprised her, not because he spoke, but because they were so gently delivered. They held no pity. Just fact. She looked at him then, really looked. His face was strong and weather-shaped, his jaw lined with unshaven stubble. The scar along his left temple had faded into something pale and quiet, and his eyes, though dark, held no hardness. "Why do you live up here?" she asked later, as they peeled carrots by the door. "All alone?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the cabin door and let the wind howl in for a moment before closing it again. "To be alone is safer than being hunted." She nodded slowly. "My mother used to say town folks like to find monsters where they buried their guilt." Chaska looked at her for a long time, then turned back to the knife in his hand. "Your mother was wise." Willa swallowed, her throat tightening. "She died last week. Consumption." "I'm sorry." That, too, came without embellishment. But it was the first time he'd said something that soft. She held to it. By the fire that evening, they sat across from each other, the stew pot simmering low. Willa stitched a torn seam on her sleeve, fingers pricked raw, eyes sore. Chaska whittled something small from a block of cedar, his hands moving without pause. "Do you miss your people?" she asked, half afraid of the answer. "Yes," he said simply. "But I still carry them." She didn't ask more. Didn't need to. There was a silence in him that wasn't empty but full of memory, of places she would never know, of voices that had once sung under stars. Later that night, she dreamt of her mother's voice calling her from the kitchen, of flour-dusted hands and the sound of curtains blowing. When she woke, she was crying. Her cheeks were wet, her hands clenched in the pelt beneath her. She didn't expect Chaska to be there. But he was sitting near the door, knife in hand, eyes half closed but alert. "I'm fine," she whispered. He nodded once, said nothing. She reached out, not to him, but to the kettle. He passed it to her before she asked. In that moment, something shifted. Not big. Not loud. Just a thread, woven quietly. The next morning, Willa asked to help with the traps. He hesitated but handed her a second pair of gloves and a heavy wool scarf. She bundled up and followed him into the woods, her steps sinking into fresh snow. They walked single file, the wind biting at their eyes. At first, the silence felt strange out here, with no walls to hold it. But after a while, she began to hear things she hadn't noticed before, the groan of trees beneath snow weight, the distant crack of ice loosening on a stream, the soft crunch of their boots in rhythm. When they reached the first trap, a rabbit, still warm, he knelt and whispered something in his language. "A thank you," she guessed. Then he reset the trap and handed her the animal. She flinched, but didn't refuse. Blood was part of life, Ma had said. So was taking only what you need. The walk back was easier. He didn't offer to carry the bundle. He trusted her to. That evening, she lit the fire herself. It caught on the first try. He watched her with a faint curve at the edge of his mouth. "You've got a spark," he said. "Most folks in town would say I'm weak," she murmured. "Most folks don't know what strength is." They sat closer that night, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's warmth without words. She asked about the figure he was carving. He didn't answer. Just turned the wood in his hand to show her small, blocky arms, strong chin, a braid running down the back. The form looked familiar. "She's not pretty," Willa said, her voice catching. "She's not meant to be," he replied. "She's meant to stand." The fire popped. She turned back to the embroidery in her lap, trying to hide the way her lip quivered. The days blended. Morning to night. Cold to colder. But in the cabin, things softened. She began to hum while cooking. He began to pause when passing her by. Once, their hands brushed as they reached for the same pan, and neither moved away. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something like trust, blooming slow as frost melt. When she mended one of his shirts, he said, "Thank you." When she asked him what plants were safe for tea, he said, "Let's find out together." When she shivered in the middle of the night, he draped his spare coat over her without waking her. She only knew because she saw him the next morning, wearing none. One morning, she asked, "Do you hate them?" "Who?" "The ones who look at you like a curse." He shrugged. "I used to. Now I carry it like I carry the mountains. Heavy, but mine." She closed her eyes. "I think I'm tired of being small," she said softly. "Tired of being forgotten, or pitied, or looked over." He didn't speak. Instead, he handed her the wooden figure. "For you." She held it in both hands, breath caught. "You carved me?" "I carved someone I hoped would come." She looked up then, into eyes that had seen too much, and didn't ask for anything in return. Outside, the snow was starting to melt. Drip by drip, the icicles wept against the eaves. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was thinking about it. And for the first time in what felt like years, so was she. Snow didn't shout its presence, it whispered. It crept into the eaves, curled beneath doorframes, hushed voices before they rose. And in that silence, Willa May Hart learned things she never would have heard in town. She learned the sound of Chaska's breath, steady in the early dawn, and how it changed when he dreamed. She learned how to judge the day's mood by the creak of the pines, how to read the wind's warnings by the way smoke shifted through the flue. She learned, too, how quiet a person could become when they stopped needing to prove they were worthy of staying alive. The snow had locked them in for 11 days. Not a soul had ridden past. The world below the ridge may as well have vanished, swallowed by white. In that time, Willa forgot to miss the sound of bells or gossip. Her hands grew rough with work. Her cheeks pinked with cold. But her heart softened. That morning, she pulled water from the well with Chaska's old leather gloves too big on her hands. The cold bit through, but she liked the ache of it. It made her feel useful. Alive. Inside, Chaska stirred the ash under the kettle with a stick carved bone-thin. He didn't look at her when she returned, but she knew he'd counted her steps the whole way down the path and back. She set the bucket near the hearth and blew on her fingers. "You should take the good gloves," he said without turning. "I like the work gloves better," she replied. That made him look at her. Just once. His gaze warm, amused, the way firelight flickers along a floorboard. After breakfast, venison stew thinned with root vegetables, they went out to check the snare lines together. Willa carried the basket, and Chaska the hatchet. The forest was quiet as a church without prayer. Their boots broke crusted snow in rhythm, neither of them speaking. They didn't need to. She knew how he moved now, how he paused before a ridge, how he turned to catch her eye before stepping over ice-hollowed creeks. When he slowed, she slowed. When she stumbled, he extended a hand but never pulled. She had to right herself. He let her. At the second snare, a rabbit lay curled in death, already stiff. Chaska removed it with a practiced hand, then whispered something again, soft syllables that sounded like wind through dry grass. "You always do that?" she asked. "Yes." "What does it mean?" "I thank the animal," he said. "I ask its spirit to go clean." She stood beside him, not quite close enough to touch. "That's beautiful." "It's right." They reset the trap together. Willa's fingers worked slower than his, but he didn't correct her. When she finished, he gave a nod. A quiet kind of pride passed between them. On the walk back, she broke the silence. "Did you ever lose someone?" He didn't answer immediately. Snow fell between them like breath. "Yes," he said at last. "My brother. Before the army burned our home." She looked down. "I'm sorry." He shook his head once, not in anger but in finality. "He walks ahead of me now. That's how I know which way to go." Willa thought of her mother then, how she'd always known when Willa needed warmth, or space, or simply a hand on her back. Maybe the dead didn't vanish. Maybe they just moved into a different kind of presence. Later that day, Willa gathered herbs from the shelf to brew a tea she'd never tried before. Chaska watched her hands as she measured and stirred, the steam wrapping around her face like a shawl. She poured 2 cups. Passed him one. "It's bitter," she warned. "I can take bitter," he replied. They drank in silence. The fire popped. "I used to think quiet meant something was wrong," she said softly. "Back in town, quiet was punishment. The worst thing Ma could do was go quiet." He nodded. "Here, it means peace." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "That's new for me." "Then stay quiet longer." She smiled, barely, but truly. By dusk, they were back at work. She mended a rip in his satchel while he sharpened a blade. The sound of the whetstone was soft, repetitive. Comforting. She spoke without lifting her eyes. "Do you think folks like us are allowed to want more?" Chaska's movements stilled. "More than just surviving." He put the blade down. "Wanting doesn't make you ungrateful," he said. "It means your spirit's not done growing." That night, she took longer curling into her bedroll. The cabin felt smaller than before, warmer, safer. She watched the light flicker across the ceiling. She didn't cry. Didn't ache. For once, she simply existed. Sometime before midnight, she heard him stir. She turned to see him near the door, staring out through a narrow crack in the shutter. His body was still, but his shoulders were tense. "What is it?" she whispered. He didn't look back. "I thought I heard hooves." She rose, barefoot, and padded over. The wind howled low through the trees. Nothing moved in the dark but snow. "I hear nothing," she said. "Neither do I now," he murmured. Maybe the mountain was dreaming. She watched him for a long time. "Do you sleep well?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at her, eyes dark and open. "You are not like the others," he said. Her throat caught. "Because I'm small?" "Because you listen." She lowered her eyes, heart thudding against her ribs. He moved aside to let her return to bed, but his words stayed near. In the following days, their rhythm deepened. She rose when he rose. She cleaned while he hunted. When she hummed, he whittled. When he sharpened, she stitched. It wasn't romance, not the way the town would name it. But it was something finer. A slow alignment. A hush that filled rather than hollowed. He carved another figure, this one even smaller, no arms, just a wide base and a round top. When she asked what it was, he said, "It's for luck. You keep it by the door." She placed it next to her boots. "Does it work?" He shrugged. "You're still here." And that, she realized, was a gift greater than love spoken too soon. She was still here. Still waking each morning. Still making tea. Still being looked at like she belonged. One evening, she saw herself in the tin mirror above the wash basin. Her cheeks had color. Her eyes, once dimmed by grief, held fire again. Chaska came in behind her, holding a log for the fire. Their eyes met in the warped reflection. "You look taller," he said. She laughed softly. "Snow teaches you to stand straighter." "No," he said, turning toward the hearth. "It teaches you to listen." She looked at herself a moment longer, then stepped into the room, back toward the firelight, toward whatever might come next. And outside, the snow began to soften, one flake at a time. By the time the thaw reached the ridgeline, the creek near Chaska's cabin had found its voice again, and Willa's hands no longer cracked from cold. The air carried hints of pine sap and thawing loam, and the wind no longer sliced, it whispered. Snow shrank into shaded gullies. Her borrowed boots left damp tracks instead of prints. But the melt brought more than water. It brought memory. And with it, consequence. That morning, she stood on the cabin stoop with a sack slung over her shoulder. "I need to see Agnes," she said. "And check the house." Chaska didn't argue. He tied the strap of his satchel and handed her a pouch of dried meat, his face unreadable. "If the pass floods, wait it out. I'll be back before sunset." She left just after dawn, riding old Ginny slow down the mountain trail. Every hoofstep kicked mud. Every bend in the trail felt sharper now, like the world had been remade while they were tucked away, and she wasn't sure if she still fit its shape. The town looked smaller coming down from the ridge, meaner, too. Weather-worn shingles, windows thick with dust, folks moving like they had something sour in their mouths. Spring hadn't reached their spirits. She tethered Ginny near the old chapel and walked the rest of the way, her coat still patched and sleeves too long. Heads turned. Conversations thinned. The Smith boy, no older than 10, muttered something to his mother, who yanked him by the arm. "Don't stare," she hissed, but not at the boy. Willa walked past the bakery, where Tess Rollins stood in the doorway in a powder-blue bonnet, surrounded by women with thin gloves and thinner smiles. "Well, look who Snow didn't keep," Tess said, her tone bright and sharp. Willa didn't answer. Just nodded and kept walking. "You smell like smoke," Tess called after her. "Is that what happens when you shack up with a wild man?" That stopped her. Willa turned, slow. Her voice stayed soft. I was warm. Federal safe. Tess blinked, mouth twisting. You always did like leftovers, she muttered. Willa didn't flinch. But inside, a crack spread. Not because she believed Tess, but because she remembered believing her once. She found old Agnes on the porch of her cottage, skin parchment thin and wrapped in a shawl stitched with careful, crooked hands. The old woman smiled through missing teeth. You didn't freeze, she said. No, ma'am. I didn't. Agnes patted the seat beside her. Willa sank down, letting the silence settle before it could curdle. Town's been talkin', Agnes said. They always do. They say you've been keeping Apache company. I've been surviving. Agnes looked at her, eyes sharp as needles. Was it kindness? Willa stared ahead. He didn't speak much. But the silence was kind. Agnes nodded. That's worth more than 100 sermons. Willa helped her shell beans, hands working slow and even. The porch creaked beneath their weight. Somewhere down the lane, a horse neighed and a door slammed. Life moved on, even when people clung to their venom. Later, Willa walked to her childhood home. The windows had been boarded by neighbors who feared looters. Inside, it smelled of dust and memory. She stepped into the kitchen, touched the windowsill where her mother once kept her herbs. There was nothing left to salvage but the quilt folded across the chair, her mother's last stitching, faded rose patterns and worn edges. She wrapped it around her shoulders before leaving. Outside, the clouds had thickened. The air had shifted. She felt it in her bones. At the edge of the square, near the general store, a crowd had formed. Sheriff Amos Pike stood with arms folded. 3 men Willa didn't know flanked him, ranch hands, judging by their boots and the way their eyes lingered too long. She paused. Pike saw her. His face didn't soften. Willa May, he said, voice flat. We've heard some things. I'm sure you have. You've been up the ridge. Alone. I wasn't alone. One of the men chuckled. Ain't that the problem? She met Pike's gaze. I came for supplies. And to check on Agnes. That's not what folks are a-skinned at. Then folks should ask better questions. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Willa, this town's got a memory like a mule and the grace of a snake. They don't forget, and they sure don't forgive what they don't understand. I'm not asking them to. Then you best keep walking. She nodded, slowly. I will. But not before walking into the store and buying salt, matches, and needles with what little coin she had left. The clerk didn't speak. Didn't smile. Just counted her change with deliberate slowness. When she stepped outside again, Tess was waiting. You think you're strong now? She asked, stepping into Willa's path. You think hiding in a shack with a savage makes you something new? I think I'm not afraid of you anymore. Tess's eyes narrowed. He'll leave you. They always do. Willa stepped around her without another word. The quilt hung from her shoulders like a flag too heavy to fly, but still hers. The sun broke briefly as she mounted old Ginny. Light hit her hair, her face, her shoulders. No one clapped. No one wept. But the breeze that stirred her braid felt like grace. At the bend where the trail met the trees, she turned once. No one watched her go. But somewhere deep in the forest, something waited. Not with longing, but with patience. She rode hard, the saddle biting into her legs, her hands aching from the chill. The clouds rolled faster than expected, turning the light silver and strange. As she neared the ridge, thunder cracked. The sky had swallowed her again. By the time she reached the cabin, her cheeks were raw and her sleeves soaked. Chaska met her at the door, his hands rough with soil and bark. You stayed long, he said. They wanted me ashamed. Did they succeed? She shook her head. He took the sack from her hands and hung it near the fire. She laid the quilt over the cot, smoothing it with deliberate care. That night, as they shared tea brewed from pine tips and mint, he asked no questions. She offered no story. But she placed her mother's quilt over both their shoulders as they sat beside the fire. And he didn't pull away. Outside, the storm returned, but it didn't enter. And inside, Willa sat taller than she ever had before. The last snow melted slow, like regret easing from old bones. It slipped down the eaves in thin rivulets, pattered through the pine needles, pooled in earth still stubborn with chill. And though the land softened, the tension in the air sharpened. Some things thawed only on the surface. Willa woke to birdsong instead of wind. The kind that hinted green things were stirring beneath winter's silence. She rose before the sun had climbed the ridge, her braid coming undone, her hands smelling of pine and soap. The cabin had grown familiar, not just a shelter, but a rhythm. She knew which board creaked when she stepped too far left, which drawer stuck, how the light moved across Chaska's carved figures as day unfolded. He stood outside, axe slung over his shoulder, bare arms glistening with sweat. The woodpile had grown tall. He split logs with the same quiet grace he did everything, with weight, with purpose. "They'll come soon," he said, without looking at her. "Who?" He let the axe fall into the stump. "The ones who can't stand peace." She swallowed hard. "Because of me?" "Because of me. But they'll use your name." Later, over bread and honey-root tea, she touched the edge of the small cedar figure he'd carved, now worn smooth where her thumb often passed. "I can leave," she said. "If it'll keep you safe." He shook his head. "Safety's not in leaving. It's in choosing. I choose to stay." He met her eyes then, and something passed between them that didn't need a name. She'd stopped hoping he'd touch her face or speak poetry. His presence was the poem, constant, solid, real. But the world outside their walls didn't understand poetry. It wanted noise. Proof. Punishment. By midday, the wind shifted. Chaska paused while hanging traps to dry and lifted his head. "Writers," he said. Willa's chest tightened. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She readied tea, not because she needed it, but because her hands wanted purpose. Her fingers shook as she poured, and the scent of dried mint rose like memory. By the time the first hoofbeats stirred dust near the edge of the tree-line, she was standing at the cabin door, the quilt around her shoulders, the fire low behind her. 3 men on horseback. She recognized the middle one, Elam Kerr, whose brother had died fighting Apache years ago. His face was carved of spite and whiskey. The others she did not know, but their eyes mirrored his. All fire, no thought. "You in there, red man?" Kerr shouted. "Time you stopped playing husband to a settler girl." Chaska stepped into the open, slow and without fear. No weapons in hand. Just height, presence, calm. Willa stepped beside him. Her voice did not tremble. "I'm not his wife." Kerr spat. "Then what are you? His whore?" She didn't blink. "No. But I'd rather warm his fire than die beside yours." Kerr's face twisted. "You speak like you think that matters. Like words'll save him." Chaska spoke then, low and even. "Leave now. Or leave different." One of the younger men laughed and swung down from his horse, fingers twitching toward his belt. "I think she needs teachin', dot." Willa moved first. She stepped between Chaska and the man, standing firm in the mud. "Touch me," she said, "and I'll bury you myself." The man froze. Not from fear, but from surprise. Kerr sneered. "You got courage, girl. But you don't know what kind of men we are." "I do," Willa said, her voice flat. "You're the kind that hang quiet people to make yourselves louder." The moment snapped. The man lunged. Chaska moved faster. A blur, his body swept forward, grabbed the man mid-step, twisted, slammed him to the earth. The snow-melt mud muffled the thud, but not the cry that followed. Chaska did not strike again. He stepped back, watching, daring the others to move. The second man drew steel. And then Sheriff Pike's voice cut through the air like a whip. "That's enough." All turned. The sheriff had arrived, alone, rifle in hand but not raised. His horse snorted behind him, uneasy. "Put it away, Curtis," Pike said to the man with the knife. Curtis hesitated, then lowered his arm. Kerr snarled. "This ain't law business, Amos. This is town pride." Pike looked to Willa. Then to Chaska. Then back to Kerr. "We're not spilling blood over pride. Not again. She's shaming the whole valley." "She's breathing," Pike said. "That's more than most folks managed this winter." Silence. Then Willa, voice quiet but firm, "You can gossip me into nothing. You can say what you want. But I've been fed, warmed, and kept whole by this man. And not one of you ever offered me more than a glance and a warning." Chaska didn't touch her. But he stood beside her, and that was enough. Pike looked at Kerr. "Get out of here." Kerr fumed. But he mounted. The others followed. Mud churned under their hooves as they vanished into the trees. When they were gone, Pike turned to her. "You good?" "I am now." He nodded, wiped his brow. "You know this won't stop. They'll just mutter louder." "I know." "You staying?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." He gave Chaska a look, something between warning and respect. "Don't give 'em reason." "I never did." With that, the sheriff turned his horse and rode away, leaving only the rustle of pine and the settling hush of aftermath. Inside, Willa set the kettle back on the stove. Her hands moved slow, deliberate. Chaska sat at the table, watching her. "I would have hurt them more," he said, "if you hadn't stepped forward. I didn't want you to spill blood." "Would you have fought?" "I already did." She poured him tea. Poured herself some, too. Sat across from him. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not leaving." She took a sip, then smiled faintly. "Snow melted. But you stayed." He reached across the table, not for her hand, but for the small carved figure she'd left there. He turned it once between his fingers, then set it down beside a second figure, unfinished but taking shape. The two forms sat there, close but not touching. By the hearth, the fire cracked and danced. Outside, the thaw continued. Birds returned to the branches. The pines, once bent with ice, began to stretch upward again. And in that cabin on the ridge, something stronger than spring had begun to bloom. Some stories don't end in thunder or wedding bells. Some end in choices, quiet, brave ones. In standing beside someone when the world says sit down. In speaking only when it matters most. If ever you feel too small, too strange, too shamed to be worth loving, remember this. Roots don't always grow in soft soil. Sometimes they need the storm.